So one of the things I wanted to do today is everybody thinks of the three weapons laboratories as nuclear weapons, but we're a lot more than that. I'm going to use Los Alamos as an example, but I've got colleagues and counterparts both at at Sandia and at Livermore that have same kinds of mission space. And it's really about how do the three labs anticipate what the government is needing, come up with innovative solutions to those problems, and then help by delivering on the challenges that the government is facing in responding to international crises. And so that's sort of what I wanted to leave you with when we get done. And I'm going to use a series of examples from Los Alamos, but these types of things go on both at Livermore and at Sandia. So if you have specific questions on those two labs, I can try, but I think there's some other folks around that can answer them a little better than I can. So you all know the history of Los Alamos, and you have had a talk on the history, but it was formed to solve a national problem. You may have seen the letter from Albert Einstein to the president at that time, warning him of a technology surprise issue. And one of the things that the three labs try to do is anticipate that technological surprise from new scientific developments and how those things might be used in favor of the United States or against the United States. And so I'll try and frame a lot of what I'm going to talk about in that kind of a specter. When you look at Los Alamos, we're really organized around three basic pillars. We've got energy security and emerging threats in that kind of an energy realm, the traditional nuclear weapons activities, and then protecting against nuclear things that exist around the world. But it's all underpinned by basic science and engineering capabilities. And so I'm going to use a few examples here to illustrate how that's all glued together. Livermore does this in a very similar fashion, but they're more highly matrixed than Los Alamos is. Sandia does it in a slightly different organizational tact, but all three labs really do address the full spectrum of national challenges. So when you start looking at these, one of the things that I'm going to start with are the materials pieces over here, and I'll walk that through the whole talk. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with the now retired director of Livermore. He had been at that point in time the head of their nuclear weapons program, and he was complaining that the nuclear weapons program has turned into nothing but a materials challenge. I happen to have a materials background, so I enjoyed that. But that becomes a key piece when you begin looking at what other countries are doing today in terms of national threat, particularly in the nuclear world. Nuclear fuels evolution, the protection and the tracking of nuclear materials, how you go about detecting nuclear fuels. They're all tied to some sort of detection and manufacturing problem. You get into the problem that the Stockpile Stewardship Program has had since 1992. We don't go do any experimental work anymore out in a full-scale stand-up test. We do a lot of small-scale experiments, but we don't do that big integrated experiment anymore. So how do you compute that? Back in the early 90s, people said, we can do that with computers, but we're going to need something a whole lot bigger than anybody's ever thought about. So parallel architecture came about. The codes that we run on those machines have to evolve dramatically and evolve in many ways to capture the neutronics, the fluid flow, the way in which turbulence interacts with the explosively driven shock. That's a big challenge. Well, over time, we figured that out. What the U.S. used in its design of nuclear weapons is actually less powerful than that machine right there. Now take that and evolve it to where other countries are now having nuclear aspirations, whether they be for civilian application or military application. Those types of computer codes are readily available today. That machine is capable of running something that was much more, I mean, we designed our entire U.S. nuclear weapon stockpile on. So you can think how the computational world has evolved in international space and how people with aspirations have changed the dynamic. And you can think about that for a minute. Experimental pieces. How do you take and get a picture of something as it's being driven by high explosives? And people have looked at the ways in which to do that. Today we do that through radiography. Los Alamos has a 2-axis radiography machine that Livermore uses as well, where we put something of interest out here in the middle. One axis can take 4 pictures of something as it moves from about this big to this big explosively. The other one takes a single picture, very high resolution. I think all of you toured the Lance accelerator, which is the 0.8 of a kilometer long LINAC that sits out at the T-53 Mesa. There's a materials aspect down at the Lujan Center that I think you got a chance to look at. Did you get the chance to tour PRAD? Okay. The PRAD facility gives people an opportunity to look at the dynamics of many moving activities, explosively driven or driven by other means. It's interesting. There are several other countries that have now duplicated both those capabilities for their own programs. And they have seen what the United States has done. We've published. They said, oh, okay, maybe they've got something. We'll go duplicate it. But the physics behind the big accelerators, the materials work that goes on in evaluating the materials that are being driven in front of them, that all ties back into this program, and this program. And so it all begins to tie together. But it's driven by basic science that goes into how one drives a big accelerator and how one goes evaluating the radiographic product that comes out. When the United States goes and negotiates a treaty with people, it becomes law that supersedes U.S. national law. And a lot of folks don't understand that. But one of the things that the U.S. does is we try to figure out how to verify treaties before we go enact them. And so many of you are aware of the discussion and debate going on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty today. Well, the 3 labs are heavily engaged in how do we go about verifying that other countries are abiding by the treaty they signed up to. The Earth and Space Sciences activities look at, can you go detect a small-scale explosion any place in the world that somebody might be trying to develop a military application of nuclear energy? Can you go look for someone doing an atmospheric test? Well, today, Sandia and Los Alamos jointly, for the past 50 years, have had a whole series of satellites orbiting the U.S. verifying treaty compliance internationally. And so when you look at the way in which the U.S. government tries to then go about solving various difficult problems, they come back to these labs and say, hey, how might we do that? So for the last 50 years, those 2 labs have been flying satellites looking around the globe. Today that's done on GPS satellites. I talked a little bit about how the computer enhancements have driven the ability to look at these, but then you come back and you look at what are other countries capable of doing? And you think about the aspirations of many other countries. I think everybody's read the news associated with what's going on in North Korea, what's going on in Iran. There's been less open press about what's going on in India and Pakistan and the challenge between the 2 countries there. But there is a significant rivalry, and if I were to go characterize things today, that's probably where the most active nuclear weapons development program is going on any place in the world. between those two countries. How do you go help advise the U.S. government about what's going on? And so they understand what's happening in that realm. The three labs are heavily engaged in that. I'm trying to give you a feel for that without getting into something we can't talk about out here in Santa Fe. So I'm going to point to a couple of things. I mentioned North Korea. They have a new young leader who has some interesting aspirations. We're not exactly sure what he's thinking about or what he's planning to do. They've done some things nobody thought were possible. We would love to know a lot more about that nuclear test that occurred this year. They did a very good job of camouflaging that. It would be really nice to know even what materials they used. We can't tell. Civilian nuclear power. There are many countries today who have never been involved in nuclear activities, but they're seeing the price of oil, the price of coal, environmental issues, regulation of CO2, and the impacts on the environment. And they're going, well, maybe we can go drive our national economy through acquisition of nuclear power. But these countries don't have what I'll call a nuclear safety culture. They don't understand how one goes about controlling nuclear materials to ensure that somebody doesn't try to divert some of that material after it's been run through a reactor to go do something that maybe would be of military interest rather than a civilian interest. The Japanese are extremely concerned that someone might accuse them of diverting their stockpiles of separated plutonium from their reprocessing facilities into a military program. So in our case, they've come and talked to the United States government and us at the laboratory. This happens to be a spent fuel pool in Japan. Some people raised a question, well, geez, if they were to pull a few rods out of each one of these bundles and go reprocess them, we'd never know that they took the plutonium and went and did something with it. So the Japanese came back and said, is there a way that Los Alamos could help us put a detector down in here and measure each one of these fuel bundles so that we can prove to the world we're not diverting material out of our spent fuel pool? So right now I've got some folks in Japan with a detector measuring fuel bundles in spent fuel pools. I have several Japanese showing up next week, and they're going to see if we can help them measure all the nuclear material that's sitting at Fukushima that melted, so that they can prove that nobody took any of it. It would be a little hard right now. It's in a condition that probably you don't want to put your hands on. But they're very concerned that they get accused as a country of diverting material. And so they want the credibility that the United States brings in looking at those problems. That's a real challenge when you look at the radiation environment in that pool. You're underwater. How do you put a detector in there with the background radiation and say nobody's diverted anything out of that bundle? That's a real challenge from a science standpoint, but it begins to follow over into international policy space very quickly. This happens to be a guy by the name of A.Q. Khan, helped advance the Pakistani nuclear weapons program rather substantially. We'd like to know a little bit more of who he shared his information with. That happens to be a leader from Iran. We'd like to know what his real aspirations are. So when you begin to look at the kinds of things that the labs begin to represent, there's a tremendous amount of nuclear expertise that the government has invested in over the last 70 years. Everybody thinks of the nuclear weapons program, and that's sort of the brand that these three labs have. But there are so many things that get spun out of that. A lot of us like to refer to, it takes a nuclear weapons lab to find a nuclear weapons lab. The things that people are doing, the kinds of activities that they're pursuing, the papers that their people are publishing, begin to point fingers and signatures on what different countries' intents are. This happens to be a centrifuge bank in Iran. You've all heard about the work going on to separate plutonium-235 and enrich their uranium stocks to about a 20% enrichment level. That's the majority of the work in enriching uranium. The next step from 20% to 93% is less of a problem than getting it to here. That's a piece that gets lost on a lot of people. So what are their intent? Is it truly a peaceful program to go build a reactor to generate medical isotopes for the Middle East? Or has it got some other purpose? This happens to be an orphaned radioactive source. I happen to have a group that runs around the world. I call them the nuclear junk collectors. I think it took offense at first when I called them that, and I think they now take pride in it. But they literally go around the world and pick up nuclear materials that people don't want anymore. There happened to be a very large cobalt-60 source that a hospital in New Jersey had no longer wanted. It had been sitting with essentially no safeguards around it for quite some time. It would make an ideal source to go do something and make it very hard for people to repopulate a specific area. We went and collected it, disposed of it properly, and got it off the streets. That kind of thing we've done with the Indian government because they have the same problem, and trying to teach them how to do that. Going and sharing that technology with other countries so that they can then begin to manage their nuclear material inventories. Everybody looks at the front end of the nuclear problems and they say, nuclear power, we want to get engaged. It's a cheap form of energy for our country. They forget about the entire back end stream. How do you handle the nuclear waste? What do you do with the contaminated products from activation of the reactor itself? How do you deal with the health effects of workers in the space? How do you deal with something as simple as, and I'm going to use an Indian example, you have a very different structure in terms of the society and the expectations of very senior leaders versus the lower level caste members in the society. Will the lab director submit to a drug test from a human reliability standpoint that he's not doing anything nefarious when the technician is several steps below him in their structure? That's a real challenge for them. We had a number of the Indian lab directors at Los Alamos about a year ago, and we talked about that with them. And I actually got a question, well, do you fill out that kind of paperwork? Do you go take that test? To them, it was very, very hard from their society context to be able to do that. We're trying to help them understand it. They made a real transformation in nuclear safety. Now we have to help them with material control, accountability, and the way in which you look after the safety of the nuclear materials. When you look at protecting against nefarious nuclear activities, ideally, you'd like to figure out, back here when somebody is planning something and interdict it and say, you don't really want to do that. One of the big challenges in anything nuclear is how do you get your hands on the materials, or how do you make the materials? Like George Miller said, it's a materials problem. So how do you go about doing that? The technology associated with doing things with nuclear activities today is pretty well known. Getting your hands on nuclear materials tends to be the big challenge and the big problem. Design, fabrication, once you've got a design, making it, there's some issues associated with personnel exposure. These materials don't typically handle the way steel would or aluminum. So there's a learning curve for countries there. You'd like to figure out what's the intent of an organization or a country back in this realm. If they make it past this gate, they've got to store the material someplace, store the device someplace, do something with it, then put it on a target that they've picked. You'd like to catch that someplace here before they go put it someplace and use it. But if they have, Now you want to figure out who did it. All three labs are heavily involved in all aspects across here, including the whodunit aspects of it and advising the government, here's what we know technically. The chemistry looked like this, the material was such and such, it has these isotopes, it probably has this kind of a history. Somebody else goes and makes the attribution of it was country A. But we do the three labs tend to do the technical aspects of here's what's in that. So that's a statement out of NNSA's strategic plan. And I put that up there because it's a rather significant piece that I think gets lost many times when we think of what NNSA's overall mission set is. Everybody understands the nuclear weapons aspect. That's the thing that everybody sees. It's a lot more than that. When we get into the global security world, we've got a whole lot of other countries that are out there undergoing significant modernization programs. This happens to be Russia, China, that's Pakistan, India. These represent their new fielded systems. They're actually building new systems. The Russians just tested their new ICBM. What's their intent with that? The president just announced the reduction in the U.S. stockpile if the Russians reduce their stockpile. The Russians have also signaled the United States they'll reduce if we change our conventional force structure as well. That begins to get into a whole range of discussions that the government reaches back into these three labs for technical advice. How we go about assessing what other countries' intents are, what their capabilities are, and what their long-range plans are. We begin to be able to help advise the government on a path forward, and in many cases, help drive the agenda for international reductions in nuclear stockpiles. All three labs engage heavily in what I'm going to call an emergency response. You always have to be prepared for something going wrong. It could be with something that is U.S. owned. It could be something that's owned by some other country. It could be something that some other country where the United States loses. So all three labs jointly go respond in exercises with the U.S. military. We recently did one aboard that carrier where our folks were on board the carrier looking at something that might have occurred in a simulated scenario. And they were looking at, okay, now how do we deal with it and get it in a safe configuration to take the next series of steps? But it really is a joint three-lab effort to go do this kind of work for the government. I mentioned the nuclear garbage collectors. That happens to be the cobalt-60 source being packaged right there by some of my folks into a container out in New Jersey. It was then shipped back to Texas where it was repackaged for disposition. But it got off the streets and into a safe configuration where it was secured. We'll do several thousand of those this year and take them off the street. This happens to be the IAEA facility in Vienna. I have 13 people sitting in the IAEA today out of my organization. They are on a leave of absence from the laboratory. Sandia and Livermore also have people that leave on an assignment from the laboratories and go help support the U.S. mission in Vienna to help the international community understand what is going on with nuclear material control, the safety of nuclear reactors worldwide, the security of nuclear reactors worldwide, the commercial civilian fuel cycle, and looking at, is a country living up to their declarations for how they're going to manage that material. And so they'll reach back, and in Los Alamos' case, we've trained all but 2 classes of the IAEA inspectors from the inception of that to go worldwide. So when somebody talks about an IAEA inspection in, I'll pick a country, South Korea, it may be inspectors from Cuba, Albania, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, all descending on that country to look at the way in which they manage their inventory of materials and the way in which they manage the safety of their reactors. I mentioned the looking from space and monitoring for any clandestine above-ground nuclear tests. Sandia and Los Alamos actually fly packages on satellites in half the last 50 years. That program is something that doesn't get talked about much, but it sits there and makes sure that we can tell if other countries are complying with the treaties. The last picture is, that happens to be in the Ukraine. It's a portal monitor. It was a nice day. That was installed as part of a second line of defense to look at nuclear material smuggling across the border in and out of the Ukraine. And there have been cases where we've caught people trying to smuggle nuclear materials. So the emerging threats that we see that you try and anticipate, climate change is going to be a major issue. What happens when ships can now go around the north side of Canada? What happens when the oil reserves north of Alaska, between Alaska and Russia, become opened up for drilling? How does one go about safely handling those kinds of policy issues? There's going to be conflict between various countries for the entire Northwest Passage associated with the ice cap moving. How do you help the government begin to understand what that means, both from a national security perspective, an energy security perspective, and dealing with the safety of deep water drilling in cold water? Many other countries are pursuing major military force changes and improvements. What's that mean? Unfortunately, us humans tend to get into conflict over natural resources. Global competition for resources doesn't seem to be getting any easier. And many countries are trying to put their arms around and learn from oil. What can they go put a market capture on and secure? Indium happens to be one of those natural resources today that probably every single one of you has a cell phone that has some in it. That's going to be a major commodity. You've seen the price go up by not quite an order of magnitude since a push was put on trying to capture that market. Space is getting rather congested. One of our satellites over the weekend came within a couple of meters of running into a defunct Russian weather satellite and taking it out. Neither one of the satellites have any steering capability anymore, but they would have made a really big debris field had they run into each other. That's going to become a more common issue. Various alliances. Who's helping who? What's the end goal when one country helps another country? And then a reemergence of various confrontational strategies. We're seeing regional alliances and regional conflict begin to change. Some of the things that are recent that we've done, you may have read about a muon tomography team that went to Fukushima to try to map where the pools of molten material were in the bottom of the vessels. Muon tomography is something that we started doing at Los Alamos out of our LDRD program. Some folks said, you know, we can probably figure out a way to go use that to go to Japan and help them understand how bad the problem really is. The Japanese thought it was going to be a decade before they could actually get the data that they got within the first year with help from us. I happen to be involved heavily in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and how did the government help BP mitigate that. BP didn't believe us when we took a machine down and radiographed the wellhead. There were 2 pieces of pipe stuck in it. They said, that can't happen. They said, there's no way. We said, well, that's why your blowout preventer won't close. We said, here's the radiograph to show it. And they said, no, it can't be. We actually hold a record now for deep water radiography. When we pulled the blowout preventer up a few weeks later, there were 2 pieces of pipe sticking out of it. They said, you guys were right. But the 3 labs jointly are the ones that put together the flow estimates for the U.S. government. We collaborated on putting that together. We were very competitive in the way which we did it. It was a very strong peer review process, and I can tell you from being in the room, it was a vocal discussion about who was right. But the government used that as the basis for the fines that BP got for the amount of oil they dumped in the Gulf. So the flow modeling capabilities that have come out of all the last 70 years found a very interesting application. The U.S. government trying to find British Petroleum for what the mess they made. Recently, we tried something out of our LDRD program, the Nevada Sites equivalent program, and NASA's internal money. For years, our deep space missions have all used plutonium-238 heat sources. Plutonium-238 decays in an 87-year cycle, half-life. It is very, very hot as it decays. So you use that to generate electricity through basically thermocouples. Problem is, we shut down our ability to make new plutonium-238 a decade or so ago, and we planned to just buy it from the Russians. The Russians have said, you know, we don't want to sell it to the United States anymore. It would be many $billions to go replicate that capability. So some of us got together and said, how about we build a uranium reactor that's self-moderating based on thermal expansion, figure out how to make it small and lightweight, tie it to the Stirling engines that NASA has been developing, and figure out how we might fly that. And everybody said, well, the bureaucracy in the safety world and nuclear safety will never let you do that. Well, we did it in Nevada last year after about 6 months using a small reactor we have out there called Flat Top, the NASA Glenn Stirling engines, and that's the concept of what it would look like flying a deep space mission. The reactor piece is this back end piece. All that basically fell out of the nuclear capabilities that have been invested in those laboratories. Years ago, the labs got involved in the human genome mapping activity. We got involved from an information science and technology standpoint. You have very large data sets of information when you begin to map the genome. The labs were good at managing large databases, so we got involved. Well, that leads you into a place where now, as you look at how might we do some things that modify bacteria to take cellulose and break it down into fuels and begin to help the bio community develop different kinds of bacteria to go address creation of fuels from waste biomaterial. So that's an activity that's heavily underway today. And when you begin thinking about these are what traditional satellites look like, that happens to be a satellite that gets launched on a very small rocket. You can launch those, and then a field commander can actually control it from a receiver that looks about the same size. That changes the way in which you go about doing things. Instead of launching something that's the size of a bus, it's something you can hold in your hand. You don't really care. Once its mission's done, it comes back down. It's so small that it just dissipates in the atmosphere. We recently launched a series of those, and we've got another series of launches teed up. Those kinds of things grew out of our space program where we were looking for other things. You may have read a little bit about the Mars lander. Sandia had a very heavy role in building the rover itself. Los Alamos built the plutonium-238 heat sources that power it. We also did something right here with the French and the European Space Agency that looks at and drills little holes in rocks. So using a laser induced breakdown spectroscopy, we can actually figure out what the chemical composition is. That grew out of looking for nuclear materials as you went to various sites around the world. That same LIBS technology can be used to take a piece of dirt, excite it, figure out what's in it, and see if somebody's telling you the truth or not. That's a fairly simple, compact piece that can be tuned for any specific element through some software. Well, it's flown on Mars now. It will probably follow, if they do a follow-on to Curiosity, there'll be another version of that that goes up there. But it's, we have a control room in Los Alamos, and there's one in France, where every other day, one side or the other takes control of the spacecraft and actually says, okay, we're going to go drill holes in those rocks. And the scientific data coming back is rather exciting. Seeing the water patterns and actually seeing gypsum deposits that could only have gotten there from water. The remote sensing technologies here came from weapons activities, came from looking at other countries. So the spin-offs that come across these become rather interesting. Spin-offs that begin to look like this. We had an individual who, the evening after the Moore, Oklahoma tornado a couple of months ago, said, you know, we did a persistent surveillance activity for the Marine Corps. I can take that news footage from the news helicopter that flew by. I can take that, rotate it into a flat plane, overlay map images, and help the Department of Homeland Security figure out exactly where the tornado moved, what houses were destroyed, what utilities were affected, and then help them go look for specific damage activities and help guide the emergency responders. So he did that evening. We uploaded that to the Department of Homeland Security the next day, and they went, oh my, we didn't realize somebody could do that. And then they started interacting with us to help guide the emergency responders looking for victims of the tornado. That was one of these things that an individual that's just incredibly creative said, I can go help, and he jumped right in. Fukushima, there was a lot of question about what actually came out of those reactors. The U.S. government spent a lot of effort looking at and trying to analyze atmospheric samples. All three labs got involved in trying to analyze that, looking at what's the impact. From a nuclear safety standpoint in other nuclear reactors, and understanding the failure mechanisms of those helps improve the safety of the U.S. reactor fleet and helps us understand what went wrong there that maybe could have been avoided with some differences in design concepts or some differences in operating philosophy and the operating license. Recently, we got approached by one of the Russian nuclear weapons labs. They all of a sudden took an interest in what could they do in terms of meteor deflection around Earth orbit after the meteor came in, and that happens to be a map showing the nuclear facilities in Russia. You can see that there's a number of them that fell right in the target area, and it damaged some of them. They got very concerned. Some of their physicists in their weapons design activities said, we think we could help. Would Los Alamos like to team with us and try to figure out how we might do a better job of protecting the Earth from those kinds of activities? So later this summer, there's going to be a joint meeting between the Russians and the United States to go deal with that problem. We'll see what comes of it. You guys have an interesting challenge ahead of you. The world's gotten rather populated. We see an ongoing set of energy challenges as people try to raise their standard of living. That and environmental issues and challenges in the environment are going to create an awful lot of conflict between various government organizations. How do we collectively go help the U.S. make the right decisions in managing environment, energy, world health, as we have this competition for various resources. That's going to be a challenge in engaging with the government and helping advise and get the right kinds of solutions on the table. So anybody got any questions?